voice from one of the great leaders there, Dr. Alan Opry-Bosak, who joined us in April. And we want to continue sharing these experiences. And so the deepest experience that has been had by anyone has been Sister Sarah Nash, who had the occasion to spend most of the summer there in South Africa at the Volmud Trust and their Youth Leadership Institute and program. And so we're glad that she is bringing back some of this teaching and learning for us as she shares about her experience today. So we invite you to give her your attention as she guides us for this morning.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you all for coming earlier this morning. I am grateful that we started off with prayer, and I also want to start off with a prayer, and it comes in the form of a poem that was given to me by a good friend of mine as he drove me to the airport to head off to South Africa. And so he gave this to me in a letter and told me I wasn't allowed to read the letter until I was actually on the plane to South Africa. And so this is, he wrote the letter, and then he sent this poem that was written by somebody else, and I read it from London to South Africa. So I was good and waited and did not read it when I wasn't supposed to. But it is a poem that I prayed every morning during my time in South Africa. So it's a poem called Mother Wisdom Speaks. Some of you I will hollow out. I will make you a cave. I will carve you so deep, the stars will shine in your darkness. You will be a bowl. You will be the cup in the rock collecting rain. I will hollow you with knives. I will not do this to make you clean. I will not do this to make you pure. You are clean already. You are pure already. I will do this because the world needs the hollowness of you. I will do this for the space that you will be. I will do this because you must be large. A passage. People will find their way through you. A bowl. People will eat from you, and their hunger will not weaken them to death. A cup to catch the sacred rain. My daughter, do not cry. Do not be afraid. Nothing you need will be lost. I am shaping you. I am making you ready. Light will flow in your hollowing. You will be filled with light. Your bones will shine. The round, open center of you will be radiant. I will call you brilliant one. I will call you daughter who is wide. I will call you transformed. And so that was what I read on my way over there, and then proceeded to cry on the plane. And then that is what I read every morning during my time there. And also what randomly reappeared my first week back while I was home in Louisville. I had a friend who read the poem to me again, not knowing that it was the poem I had been meditating on during my entire 9-week stay in South Africa. And so for me, I wanted to begin with that, because when I think about what this 9 weeks was for me in South Africa, it really was a hollowing out, and not in a way that felt like I was losing pieces of myself, but in a way that felt like the 9 weeks were preparing me to receive something, and not knowing what that was as it was happening, still trying to piece it together, but very much was feeling empty while I was there, and again, not in a negative way, but in a way of being poured out so that I could be poured into, and so that I could receive something, which I did receive something. I'm still, as you were saying, Pastor, I'm still trying to put the pieces together to figure out what this was. So the name of the program, as Pastor said, was the Volmud Youth Leadership Training Program. And it's a program that is in its second year, so I was part of the second delegation that went. But it was based after a program in the 80s in South Africa called the National Youth Leadership Training Program. And so our program director actually did the NYLTP when he was a young person fighting apartheid through a anti-racist and faith-based lens. And so he saw a need in South Africa today to sort of replicate the same program to prepare young people for leadership positions in the church and in society to fight against white supremacy and anti-Black racism. And so, yeah, the program has 5 different themes, which I have written up here: community, healing and wholeness, creation and creativity, peace and justice, and reconciliation. And so we cycled through all of those twice, except community, which the thought was we would have 1 week of community building, and then we would have to keep building community with each other for the next 8 weeks. So Alexis, if you want to click it. This is most of the group. So there was 2 of us from the United States, 1 person from Nigeria, 1 person from Zimbabwe, 1 person from Swaziland, which I had never actually heard of Swaziland before. It's a landlocked kingdom inside of South Africa. And then everybody else was from South Africa. And all of us were between the ages of 20 and 30, different Christian denominations, but all of us Christian. And then all of us involved in some kind of social or political movement in our home country. This is another group shot of us. Both of those photos were from the first week when we were very much still in the honeymoon phase of community, is what they called it. And I think we got back there by the end of it, but it was a little rough in the in-between weeks. So go ahead. And so I told my mom this yesterday. I rearranged this PowerPoint probably 5 different times because there was so much information I wanted to share, and I had no idea the best way to communicate it to folks. So I started off by doing the themes, and then that didn't feel like it covered enough. And then I started off, the second attempt was to do week by week, and that seemed like too much information, and some weeks were more exciting than other weeks. So I went back through and I read my evaluation for the program that I sent to the program director. And the first question on that evaluation was, what are the 5 most important things that you have learned? And as I read those 5 things, it was pretty apparent to me that that was what I wanted to share during this Sunday school session. And so what I'll do is I have 5 different slides with the 5 most important things that I learned, and then in between I have pictures that will remind me to share some of the stories behind the lessons. And maybe I can ask you all what you all think feels the best, because one thought I had was that after each of the 5 things, if somebody had a question about that specific lesson that I learned, maybe we can ask the question then, instead of waiting to the end, and there are 5 things and a lot of questions. So I think maybe that's what we'll do. And then at the end, if you have a question about something that happened earlier on, there'll be space for that as well. But this is the first thing that I wrote down, which is that faith and spirituality can and should be at the center of our social and political movements. That faith and spirituality do not have to remain separate from social and political affairs, and can in fact help to contribute to the dismantling of oppressive systems, even oppressive religions. And so for me, I was sharing this with Pastor last week by the door, that it was almost easier for me to begin thinking about the United States by first thinking about somebody else's context. And so one of the things that I had started wrestling with really early on in the program was that the system of apartheid was actually birthed out of a Christian denomination. So it was birthed out of the Dutch Reformed Church. And in a similar way, the resistance also was really sustained by another Christian denomination, the Anglican Church. And so holding those 2 together in a Christian-based program, asking questions of how can we both call ourselves Christians, and how can we be reading the same book and worshiping on the same hour on Sunday, and have 2 very different understandings of what living in beloved community looks like. And so for me, again, thinking about the United States and thinking about the institution of slavery and how that was really sort of spearheaded by a Christian denomination, and thinking about really the role of the historic Black church as being a space of resistance, and really wrestling with that. And the other thing too, Father Edwin, who was one of the young people who was on the front lines of the resistance, on just my second day there, I was really struggling with jet lag, being one of the 2 people from the United States, and so I was up really late, and Father Edwin, who wasn't struggling with jet lag because he's from South Africa, was just also up very late. And so I was sitting in the kitchen just drinking a cup of tea, and he came in and just sat down, and we just started talking. And one of the things that he said to me was that we being the young people in South Africa, were able to dismantle the system of apartheid because we were able to deconstruct the theology of apartheid. And that was kind of where they started, was like thinking about how can we deconstruct this false theology while also dismantling this oppressive system. And so for me, like I had multiple feelings during my 10 weeks there of actually like my brain exploding was the feeling. And that was one of the moments, because for me, I immediately thought of the false theologies that we have in the United States. And so the false theology of Make America Great Again, and the false theology of white supremacy, and the false theology of mass incarceration, and thinking about how can we begin to dismantle these from a theological space so that we can dismantle the oppressive systems that have been birthed out of these false theologies. Yeah, if you want to. So one of the highlights of the program for me was also being able to meet Archbishop Desmond Tutu, which was something I just never thought I would ever have the opportunity to do. I've had quotes that he has said on my wall since I was little. But one of the things that he said in this space that has stood out to me was that we aren't anti-anybody, we're anti-injustice, and how so often in our fight for justice we start focusing on specific people without recognizing that those people and their ideologies are symptoms of something larger than them. And so I felt really challenged by him, again, to focus on systems, to pressure people, especially public officials who sort of like manifest these systems and ideologies in really damaging ways, but to really focus on the like system aspect of fighting injustice. This is just one of my other favorite pictures, laughing with Desmond Tutu, which again, I just never thought would happen, so. And yeah, this was the group image. Yeah, and his wife, Leah, is the second on the right, and yeah, she is also just really incredible, and one of my favorite moments was that we were all asking Archbishop Desmond Tutu questions, and Leah was like, can I say something? And we're like, yes, of course. And so we all kind of like centered her and turned, and she was like, what are you all doing asking this old man all these questions? And in my head, I'm like, oh my gosh, she just called Desmond Tutu an old man. But what she was saying, and what she continued to say, is that he didn't ask questions when he was our age. He was finding the answers on the street. And so it was really a call to action for us of like, yeah, like spend time with the people who have experience doing this, but also like get your butt out of the chair and go and find the answers in the street. Like that, he's able to tell you all stuff because that's what he did. And so, yeah, I think all of us, again, just sitting in that space, really started wrestling with like, and even for me, like what is the balance of that, of like spending time with folks that have experience, which is really important and really insightful, and also like creating the experiences on our own. Okay, the second thing I learned, that the purpose of theology is to give hell, and that as Christians we are called to live and work at the margins of society, amplifying the voices of those most impacted by social injustices, while simultaneously working to deconstruct a system whose maintenance requires the continuous marginalization of people. So this is similar to the first point that I said, but the give hell was another like brain explosion moment for me, and it happened in the same conversation with Father Edwin that first week that I was in South Africa. And he shared with me a story that Desmond Tutu had shared with him about a dream Desmond Tutu had where he died and went to heaven and knocked on the gates, and St. Peter came out and said, "Who are you?" And Desmond Tutu was like, "What do you mean, who am I? Like, I'm Desmond Tutu." And St. Peter said, "Okay, I'm gonna go and check and see if your name's in the book." So he goes, he checks, he comes back out, looks at Desmond Tutu, and says, like, "Sorry, you gotta go to the other place. Like, your name's not in here." Desmond Tutu's like, "What? Like, there must be a mistake," but he went. And like minutes later, there was a big like booming knock at the gate, and so St. Peter came back out again, and it was the devil himself who was standing there. And the devil said, "You have to come get this Tutu guy. He's giving us hell down there." And again, I like had this like sensation of my brain exploding because what Father Edwin was sharing with me and what Desmond Tutu had shared with Father Edwin when he was a young person in the struggle, was that the purpose of theology is to go to the spaces where hell is and to give hell. And that, yeah, and again, this kind of connected to the first thought I had, but thinking of like, where is hell manifested in our world today with the false theologies and with the social and political injustices that are happening. And as Christians, like we are called to go to those spaces and to give those spaces hell. And yeah, I really love that, and that is something that has stayed with me and has sat with me. It's something that, if you all got my emails while I was in South Africa that were super long and few and far between because I was trying to process everything at the same time as experiencing it, this was a piece of like a really long chunk of my email of what I was wrestling with on like where are those spaces in our society, and then what is my responsibility as a Christian to go in and to give hell. Yeah, so this was also a really important piece. These were two of the facilitators, and if you're seeing, I'm currently in this photo, I'm wearing my Radical Reconciliation shirt from the Beloved Conference here at St.Johns, which was really funny because I had multiple shirts, and multiple times during the conference, people would say, like, your shirt says Beloved Community on it, like that's the theme of the week. And I was like, yeah, my church, like, this is the theme of our church, which is really wonderful. And it was also funny for me because I felt like almost every person I met was like, do you know Starsky Wilson? He's like the one person that they know from the United States out in South Africa. But it was very regular. I'm like, yeah, I know him a little bit. He's just the reason why I'm here. But in this picture, these were two of our facilitators for our first week on reconciliation. And so the guy that the guy on my left in this photo is Themba Lonzi, and the guy on my right in this photo is Wilhelm Verwoerd. And so they are part of a like international reconciliation group that goes and does reconciliation work. So they've been to Ireland, they've been to Israel, Palestine, but they're both from South Africa. And so Themba was part of the resistance as a young person, and was actually like standing next to his best friend when his best friend was shot by apartheid police. And so he had to go to his best friend's mom and tell her what had happened. They were at a protest together. And Wilhelm on the other side, if you know anything about South Africa history, his last name Verwoerd might ring a bell. His grandfather was actually the architect of the system of apartheid. So his grandfather was a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church and also held a political position in the South African government. And so his grandfather like created this whole system. And so they tell their stories together, and it is how they sort of do their reconciliation work. And their call to action really was like, how do we tell our personal stories in the context of our family stories, in the context of our nation's story? And really getting to the crux of what that means. And so for me, it was really like an ongoing question. Here in St. Louis, I'm part of the Anti-Racism Collective, which is a group of white anti-racist activists who organize and mobilize other white people in and around the St. Louis region. And so one of the things that I was really wrestling with during this week on reconciliation was the limitations and the goodness of doing like intergroup work versus intra-group work. And so I was doing a lot of that wrestling on my own. And then on the last day, I was like, Sarah, you need to ask Themba and Wilhelm what their thoughts are. And what they said is something that I've already taken back to ARC and shared with ARC, which is that both are important and both are necessary, but that the purpose of intra-group work, so working with your own people, so in my case, white people doing anti-racism work, the purpose of that work always has to be to prepare people for intergroup work, and then to have a space to come back after that intergroup work happens and to process some of that. And so I think one of the things that I shared with ARC is that sometimes it feels like we just give people the like, you're not one of those white people stamps. And so they feel like they can stop after they've come to one of our trainings, or they can stop after they've come to one of our actions that we've organized. And so really wanting to figure out like that's not actually what we're supposed to be doing. What we're supposed to be doing is like organizing and mobilizing white folks to be in this movement for the long haul. And so how do we push people, how do we prepare people to do intergroup work? How do we build relationships of accountability, which is an ongoing conversation that we have with organizations led by people of color. So we're able to like push white folks into their work when they need white folks to show up. And then how do we create space to have these like ongoing conversations when confrontation happens, because it will happen in this work. But again, this was really important. This is, yeah, you can go ahead there. This is a picture where I think you can almost see people's brains exploding, because the guy on the left is Professor John DeGrucci, who is the top Dietrich Bonhoeffer scholar in the world, which was amazing for me. And we got to do like morning Bible study sessions with him. And yeah, I think one of the things that he said, well, he said a lot of like zingers, that in my notebook, I felt like there was just like a John DeGrucci quote on the top of almost all of my pages. But one of the things that he said was that he takes the Bible too seriously to take it literally, which really stood out to me of like how do we take the Bible seriously enough to like actually find the meaning of it? And for me, a lot of what we were doing during our Bible studies was like contextualizing the Bible. And I've told Starsky this too, but I grew up Catholic, and the joke is that Catholics don't actually read the Bible, which I think is actually like, it's funny. Annie was saying this, my roommate. It's funny because it's true. And that like my first real Bible study was like my first Wednesday here at St.Johns, and I was like, oh my gosh, like there's so much here, and I've been in Catholic education from kindergarten, and I graduated from SLU, so it's been my whole life. But that is how I felt being in these Bible studies too. We tackled a lot of like sexism and patriarchy and heteronormativity and like all of these really big things, to just be able to like sit at the feet and to like wrestle with them with somebody who is, John DeGrucci, was really, really wonderful. And like, I mean, he made it really clear that he did not want us to just like open up our brains and have him dump information into them. He wanted us to push back. He said it keeps him young when he gets to work with young people who challenge him. And so, the Bible studies that we did were just really unbelievable. And the other thing I want to say about John DeGrucci, we did a whole, I guess it was a week-long Bible study on evil, and what I actually want to pull out my notebook from South Africa so I don't get his words wrong. I keep telling, I'm going to say it out loud, so I do it. I keep telling myself I'm going to scan this into a computer so that if I ever lose this book, I don't lose all that information, but I'm speaking it to the church so that I do it this week. I'm going to scan this book in. Okay, so John DeGrucci said that the challenge of today's world is that we have found that we cannot live without an enemy, and that it is an excuse to build up an army. It is an excuse to ignite our economy. We have found that in order to say who we are, we need an enemy to say who we are not. And we looked at like Adam and Eve as the example of this. That we must recognize our basic identity as human first. The other identities are important, but the human first one is the one that's the most important. And that is the beginning of all reconciliation. He said that the person we stereotype is the person that we fear, and that our imagined enemy is the person that we fear. He said, love casts out fear. And then we talked about the creation of the devil. And he talked about how we say, the devil made me do it. And he said, the devil didn't make you do it. You chose to do it. And again, we create the devil in the image of our enemy. The devil is a human creation, not a God creation. And he talked about evil being the accumulation of human sin and disobedience. And again, we looked at that through a lot of different lenses. We looked at that through the lens of sexism and racism and climate change. We talked about the flood, of how we other the flood, but how we actually need to be wrestling with like our disobedience of taking care of God's earth is what is creating these catastrophes that we're experiencing. So yeah, John DeGrucci was amazing to sit and to wrestle and to learn with him. I didn't really know where to stick the slide, so I stuck it here. But this is from our trip to Robben Island, which was the island where Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners were kept during the apartheid years. So the image in the center is Mandela's cell, which I thought was really interesting. There wasn't any kind of special sign. We wouldn't have known unless they said for cell on the right, which the thought crossed my mind, like maybe they tell, each day they pick a different cell and tell people. But what stood out to me was that was the cell that everybody went and took a picture in front of and then just like continued down the hallway. But as I stood in the hallway, I was thinking that each of these cells was filled with somebody who was considered like a dangerous leader to the apartheid regime. And there were a lot of cells. I think you've been there. It's cell after cell after cell. And that was in the like maximum security section, but there were like other facilities all over this island. And then the image at the top left, I think for me, this like idea of giving hell. So while they were all like prisoners, they had to do like really physical labor. It was part of their punishment. And so they were like in this rock quarry, literally moving rocks was what their job was. And you can see there's like the cave kind of in the background. And so that cave is where they continued to do political education while they were imprisoned. And so for me, they're like living in this hell, right? Like the conditions that they were living under were just horrifying, and that they were continuing to give hell because they were in there engaging wrestling, like figuring out how they were going to continue to dismantle these systems. So that was also a really incredible experience. And I'm also realizing I just went through 2 whole things without asking and pausing for questions. So if anybody has any questions about the first 2 points, I think they were connecting faith and spirituality and theology with social and political movements, and then the concept of giving hell.
So first off, I would like to encourage you to go ahead and scan that. Especially that piece about the person we stereotype as the person that we most fear. In the climate that we're living in right now, like that speaks volumes, especially when you spoke a little bit about, and if you could go a little further around the breaking down the theology of that support the oppressive systems. I think, I know in my work sometimes it's very difficult to put those, not difficult to put them two together, right? Because it's like, well, I can tell you my story, right? But sometimes it's best to take the personal out and put the real in, so that people don't take it as an attack, but more so as this is what we're working with, this is the reality that we live in.
Yeah, thank you.
So I wanted to ask a little bit about on the first point you talked about the theologies, the competing theologies of the Dutch Reformed Church and the Anglican Church. Interestingly enough, both of those form minorities in South Africa, although the Dutch Reformed theology was dominant. The Anglican Church also dealt with the complexity that it was one of the largest and continues to be one of the largest landowners in South Africa, thus engaged uniquely in the systems that take land away from the people, and the majority theologies are much more indigenous, or the Christian ones, radically Pentecostal. These are not they don't have the numbers. So did you have a sense to wrestle with what the kind of the challenges and tensions for the church are, and what it means to be in the minority yet be doing this work of deconstruction?
Yeah. I think in the South Africa context, the image that immediately comes to my mind was that the Fees Must Fall campaign that happened which was like young, mostly Black. In South Africa, there are really like 3 dominant racial categories. There's white, there's Black, and then there's colored in between. And so it really was led by like young Black students who really pressured universities to lower or to really eliminate university fees as a way for like reparations and restitution for the apartheid years. And the church was relatively absent during that period. And so one of the really interesting, I think people met Nkosi when he came here, which I met him like 2 weeks before he came here, which is just such a small world for me. He was one of the people that was like, do you know Starsky Wilson? But he is really, I mean, he's in a similar space of really like trying to figure out what the role of Christianity is in South Africa right now. And so even just recently, he really challenged Bosak publicly and Father Edwin publicly. And yeah, really pushed them to like, in today's world, to stay true to what they set out as their like liberation theology of the Kairos document, which was a really like foundational text to the deconstructing the theology of apartheid. Because I think what you saw in the church, and certain leaders were pretty open about it, certain leaders that we talked to, was that they felt like they won when the system of apartheid was dismantled, and so they kind of stopped. And what actually happened was there has been zero land redistribution. And I think the Anglican Church like does own a lot of land. And so now young people are kind of like back on the front lines, pushing the church, which considers itself a liberator, which is always a really interesting challenge and dynamic, and something that I think we see happening in St. Louis right now. This like ongoing tension between clergy and like young folk who are on the streets, and something we felt really like truly here at St.Johns too. So yeah, I think for me that is just an ongoing tension. I don't think there's any like blueprint answer, but young people today are really pushing for land redistribution. But the interesting thing about South Africa is you're in the context of all of these other African countries too. So one of the interesting things, it was really interesting to have a guy there from Zimbabwe, because he talked about Mugabe, who is the president / dictator of Zimbabwe, depending on how you look at it. In the 80s, during their liberation struggle, Mugabe was like, take arms and take the land back from the white farmers. And so what happened was that is what happened, and now Black people own a lot of land in Zimbabwe, but Zimbabwe got smacked with sanctions from outside of the world. So like the US has had sanctions on Zimbabwe since 2001. And so they had a really horrible recession where the ongoing joke in Zimbabwe was that they had like, numbers I hadn't even heard of before, like triple gazillion billion dollar bills. And it literally had just zeros all the way across the top of the dollar bill because inflation was so high, they were just like printing off these bills. And then they switched to the US dollar probably within the last, I want to say like the last 5-ish years. But right now and today, like they're going through their economy's tanking again. So it's really like that. The land redistribution is something that is an ongoing conversation in South Africa. It needs to be an ongoing conversation in the US. And I think certain folks are bringing that up. But yeah, like that is real tension there. Okay, third most important thing, that living in community is countercultural and incredibly challenging at times, but that it is how we are called to live our lives. That we must embrace conflict while living in community with each other, not ignore it, so that it can be addressed in a healthy and productive way without causing harm. Yeah, I mean, this kind of speaks for itself. Living in community was really, really difficult at times. We were from, I guess 5 different countries. There were 7 different languages represented in our community. English was like the common language. We all had different theological backgrounds, different education levels. So it was, I mean, there were always conflict. And I think at the beginning, we brushed them over, and they like revisited us in the middle, like really, really fiercely. And so we had to have like an outside facilitator come in and help us like sort through some of the conflict that we were having. But again, I think really when we think about it, like that was like a really intentional small community, but like our neighborhoods are supposed to be communities, and our church is supposed to be communities, and that like when we actually choose that communal lifestyle, like it is really countercultural. We're kind of socialized to like take care of ourselves and to take care of ours, and that is not actually how I think we're not called to live when we look at the life of Jesus, but that choosing to live that way is really brutal. And I think for me too, it was learning how to like lean into conflict and confrontation instead of running from it. We're socialized to be pretty conflict avoidant, but recognizing that conflict is actually like a really healthy sign of living in community. Like when you're actually living in community and you're trying to do it well, like you're gonna step on people's toes and you're gonna have your toes stepped on. And so learning and creating structures to like have and engage in that conflict was something that was really important. This was a picture, I think you met Seth while you were down in South Africa. This guy was the guy who did the week on beloved community. And this was the week that came right smack dab in the middle. Seth was a little bit of the outside facilitator who got that process going for us. But again, like really wrestling with what it means when like we're not all smiling like we did in this picture. That sometimes there were groups of people that were really mad at other groups of people. Yeah, the week that was the most difficult was we had to plan an event together, I think on our like third week that we had all been there. And so it was part of the Youth Day celebration in South Africa, which if you go out to the back and turn to your left, there's a bulletin board out there that talks a little bit about Youth Day in South Africa. But it was a full day event that turned out really well because we were able to navigate some of the conflict. But one of my favorite pieces of it was the opportunity to speak on this panel about youth love and resistance was the theme of the day. And so I sat on a panel with someone from Swaziland, someone from Zimbabwe, and somebody from South Africa, and we talked about the interconnected nature of like all of our work as like young people rooted in the church, but also engaged in social and political movements. The fourth thing is that we must work for justice and organize globally, which was a new word for me, but I loved it. Recognizing that the struggles against white supremacy and oppression are interconnected, and that we must start in our local context while also building toward a global movement of liberation. And Pastor, I think this is a little bit what you talked about of like the connectedness between St.Johns and South Africa and not really knowing what it is, but knowing that it's really good. And for me, that was also a little bit of what I experienced. So like now I have friends in the other half of the world who like send me text messages asking about what's going on in St. Louis right now because it's in international news. And there are folks that are like organizing there against the same oppression, the same white supremacy, and now we can bounce ideas off of each other. And I think one of the best examples for me of this was during our first Peace and Justice Week. Father Edward shared that a lot of the like young freedom fighters during the apartheid years were looking at the U.S. civil rights movement for inspiration and for tactics and to figure out what to do. And then because I know Starsky and I'm involved in the St. Louis context, I think that like some of us are looking at the South Africa context now, trying to figure out what they did in apartheid. So it really is this like ongoing historical conversation that's also like very much rooted in the contemporary moment, but recognizing that it's important to have those like local connections, right? Like it's important that Nkosi came here and talked here, and it's important that I met Nkosi in South Africa, and that like those relationships are building and are building really like cross-continental, which is really beautiful. Another example, I cannot remember this guy's name, but the old white man in the middle of the picture. He was a banker during the apartheid years and got a call from Desmond Tutu one day about joining the revolution, is what he said in his words. But what this guy did was he traveled to the US with Desmond Tutu and talked to Congress people about sanctioning apartheid South Africa. And it was actually like, that is kind of what turned the tide was that South Africa started to be sanctioned by really important world powers, the US being one of them, which at the National Museum of African American History in DC, I learned that Congress passed the sanctions, Reagan vetoed the sanctions, and then the Congressional Black Congress overrode Reagan's veto. So that all of this was happening, but this was a banker turned revolutionary, in his own words, that really, again, worked in that global context. And today, he's one of the people that travels, I guess to Switzerland now is where the kind of like central headquarters are, but to try to do the BDS movement to sanction Israel in support of the Palestinian people. So that, he is another person who is like using his own skills and talents as a banker to also like contribute to this global movement against white supremacy. Just another group photo. Don't have much to share there. And the fifth most important thing I learned is that we have to take care of ourselves when committing our lives to working for justice and peace, physically, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, etc. That it's important to make time and space to just be with ourselves and with those who support and hold us accountable. We must know ourselves and our boundaries in order to do the work that we have been called to do without losing ourselves in the process. And so the 9 weeks were really, really intense. It was like long sessions, long learning, but at the end of the night, we would like sit by the fire and like talk or play games. Uno was a really popular game. A lot of trash talking in a lot of different languages. People ask me if I picked up any of like the words from the languages, and I'm like, I know a lot of cuss words to use when I play Uno now. But really like learning and finding space, like where we stayed at Volmid, I have some pictures later, was just beautiful. It was stunning, and like being able to like take retreats and to just be in nature is something that like I had realized how important it was to me. So Alexis, if you want to click the pictures. So these are some of the fun pictures from South Africa. So this is on Volmid. It's right outside of the chapel, which was somewhere, that I spent a lot of time on those two benches that you see in the far back right, just kind of sitting there writing and processing a little bit. This feels important. I wanted to put this on there because where we're standing in this picture is actually right there on the top of that mountain. And we hiked up that mountain together. And I don't think any of us would have been able to do it without each other, like supporting each other, because we took the wrong path and ended up like off-roading for probably half of the way up to the top of the mountain. It was brutal. Father Edwin was like, "What took you all so long?" And we were like, but apparently we did like a path and a half and had to just trek up the side of a mountain. But again, like pushing ourselves physically, being with each other, having fun. In the picture, you can kind of see, it's not like the best angle, but at the top of the mountain, at the cross, all around you could just see like ocean. It was really, really powerful and beautiful. And to have the cross there at the top, like a very spiritual experience for all of us as well. This was a waterfall that was on the property, which also was like the place I walked to the most. I started doing it by myself, and then they were like, the baboons like hanging out there, and I was like, maybe I won't do it by myself anymore. So I was trying to like Google like what to do for a baboon encounter. Luckily, just saw them from distance. But again, just like really, really beautiful and really wonderful to like spend time like experiencing the beauty with people who have like grown really close to my heart. So the guy in the middle is Rangarirai from Zimbabwe, and then Sandra is to the right, and she's from South Africa. She's actually at the Taizé community in France right now, working with the brothers there. This is an intense game of I'm forgetting the name, dominoes? Is that, yeah, okay, good. I don't play this here in the US, so, which was another funny thing. They were all so disappointed at how little I knew about US culture. So Varashni, who's like the former editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post South Africa, she like facilitated the panel, and she was at Volmid for 2 weeks. started making fun of me for how little I knew about South African or United States culture. And so she was having a conversation with somebody else and mentioned Kanye West. And she paused the conversation and turned to me and said, "He's a US rapper, Sarah." Which that I did know, but it was an ongoing joke. Yeah, this was just beautiful. Every Saturday we had like Saturdays off, and so we would go to the town nearby called Hermanus, and yeah, this was just like really wonderful for both Rangarirai and Richard. So Richard's from Swaziland. We found that the international students like to hang out because some of the South Africans would like start speaking in their native tongue, and we were like so lost. So yeah, I would say Rangarirai and Richard were two of the guys I got closest to. But this was their first time at the ocean because both Zimbabwe and Swaziland are landlocked. And that was really cool to kind of like experience that with them. We spent a lot of time just like walking the ocean or like standing near the ocean. And again, I think seeing their awe and wonder at it reminded me like how like wonderful the ocean actually is, which was really, really beautiful. This is me eating a chicken foot, which is as gross as it sounds. But I was told that I wasn't allowed to leave South Africa if I didn't do it. And what I basically did was like lick the barbecue sauce off of it and then feed it to the dog that you can kind of see in the background. Because I did just feel like I was sucking on a chicken toenail. There's not a lot of meat there, but they love it. So that was my attempt. You can kind of see in my face in the second photo, I'm like not into it at all. We went whale watching, which we saw one whale. It was pretty early in the whale season, and it was like way far away, so we could barely count it, and like only 4 of us saw it. Yeah, but just spending time with each other was really wonderful. Yeah, and I think that's the last photo. But yeah, again, just on the ocean, having fun. Yeah, any questions? No, yeah, about any of it. I don't know what time it is.
One note as we prepare for questions, Father Edwin and Nkosi have both replied on Facebook to your presentation. And Nkosi said he was trying to live stream. We're not live streaming, but we are recording. So I committed to him to post this session on the website, so you all have an opportunity to do that.
Awesome.
So if you want to make yourself famous, you can ask a question now on the World Wide Web.
Just not too hard, so I can make sure I can answer it.
Did you see any farmland or produce?
Yeah, so where we stayed at Volmid, we were actually like in the middle of the wine valley. So there were like vineyards and grapes all around us. Yeah, farmland, like yes, and like I again, kind of what Pastor was saying. Like there's not a lot of land redistribution, so there would be like large swaths of land that didn't look like anything. It was like growing on it, but that like talking to some of the South Africans there, like you could hear like the anger in their voice talking about how like that was probably owned by like one man or one family who owned all that land. And then you go to the Black Township, which near Hermanus was a township called Zwelithle. And their like houses were on top of houses were on top of houses for as far as you could see. And like we talked to officials of Zwelithle, and they were talking about how they're like running out of room for houses with the populations continuing to grow. And so how they were talking about like creating like a second Zwelithle because it's like right on the ocean, you can't build out. But then some of the young folks in South Africa were really pushing back and were like, well, what about the like large piece of land owned, right next to Zwelithle? Like, how do you begin to sort of redistribute that? Yeah, so I saw a little bit of farmland, not a ton, but saw a lot of like wineries and vineyards, because that's kind of where we were located in South Africa.
You mentioned that you all had a talk on evil, and you talked about how we had a need to create an enemy, how we need to create this adversary, and how we process things, or how we, look at this idea of enemy as being not who we are, or being outside of who we are. And looking at how we're dealing with our struggles in the country, specifically St. Louis right now, we constantly got to define ourselves as being for Black lives, but not against police lives, or not against this. Trying to process that moving forward and get everyone together. How do you see that happening, or from what your take there, how do you see yourself fitting in? How can we incorporate that in this movement to make this process go to a point where we get everyone to buy into the struggle of liberation and not a thing of us against them?
Yeah, that is a big question that I wish there was an easy answer to, because I think for so many of us, like, that's like the ongoing question. It's really the debate of like all lives matter, right? And the response being like, yeah, we know all lives matter. All lives matter. We can't have all lives matter unless Black lives matter, which is why like we're saying Black lives matter right now, right? Yeah, I think like, so I think I've just like shared this probably during other Sunday school sessions, but I've been really, my personal theology has been really informed by the Catholic worker movement, and Dorothy Day was the founder of that. And she talks about how like the only solution is love, and love comes from community, which is tattooed on my feet. But that like in order to love each other, we must first know each other. And so when I think about St. Louis specifically and our country specifically, we live in such segregated societies by like all identities, right? By race, by class, by religion, that we don't actually have opportunities to know each other. Like our schools are segregated, our churches are segregated, our neighborhoods are segregated. And that is where I don't really know what the answer is. Like for me, the answer is like we have to be like dismantling that segregation and like creating spaces for people to like encounter the other in order to realize that there actually is no other. There's just us. But obviously policy is important. Obviously theology is important. Obviously like personal willingness to step out for a second is important. Yeah, which is why that's kind of what I want to be studying right now. So maybe I'll have an answer for you in 4 years when I graduate from Eden Seminary. But yeah, like for me, it really comes down to like we live such separate lives, and how do we begin to like live interconnected lives on like a really like individual, personal level, but then also on a like social and societal level.
So now that you're back, I mean, 8 weeks is a long time. What radical change do you see in yourself that you're just like checking yourself every day? I mean, like, this is not what I'm going to continue on doing. So what have you found in you and your day-to-day that you want to change and see maybe in other places?
Yeah, I feel like a little bit of like with what's going on in St. Louis right now, I think ambulance chasing is the best way to describe it. Like I don't actually feel like I've done a super great job at like sitting down and starting to integrate some of this stuff. I feel like I'm kind of running around and then have like moments where like I'll be like, okay, Sarah, like that self-care piece that you were talking about is like really important. And so like it's time for you to get your like butt out of the city and to go enjoy nature for a second, because that was something that felt really important. I think one thing that I've like felt as like a really big shift in my life is that pre-South Africa, my like faith and spirituality felt very separate from my like social and political involvement. And coming back, I am like forcing the two of those together, which like happens really naturally in a space like St.Johns, happens less naturally in like a space like the Anti-Racist Collective. But that like, because of South Africa conversation, like I, at our last collective meeting, like opened that up of like, I want to talk about like faith-based anti-racism, and like if there are other folks interested in our collective, like maybe we make a small group that meets and discusses about it. And almost like immediately, like 5 other folks were like, yes, like this is something that feels really important to me too. I just like didn't know if this was the space or not. So I think for me, like that is the biggest shift, is like coming back from South Africa. I can't separate the two anymore. Like I did that for a really long time, and now it's like how can I be like, what I used to say is like, how can I reclaim faith from the conservative right? Like that's what I want to do. Like I want to be unapologetically progressive and unapologetically like faith-filled, and like challenge the narrative that the conservative right like has the stronghold on faith and politics.
Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate your presentation, and as you were talking about the banker and the Bible study teacher, is he a father? Or
Do what?
the Bible study teacher, I forgot his name, but the person who taught you Bible study.
John DeGrucci. Yeah.
The banker, just the connection with Nkosi and our connection with Bozak. I was just thinking how there are all these moving parts.
Mm-hmm.
All across the world, moving in different directions. Everyone's doing something very unique and different, but at the same time, they're moving in concert.
Mm-hmm.
And I just see that, just thinking about that, that's the work of God. And so sometimes we can't really see the bigger picture, but your presentation gives us a glimpse.
Mm-hmm.
At least it gave me a glimpse that there are all these different moving parts, that God is working things together for us. And so that's encouraging to me, and I definitely appreciated the work locally, think globally phrase that you brought up, because that's what all of this kind of reminds us of. God's asking us to just kind of see the big picture, because we're all kind of moving different, kind of like a clock. That's what, the big grandfather clock. Have you ever seen the inside? That's what this reminds me of.
Yeah.
That just came to me. That's what it reminds me of. All these different, but we're all moving in concert together. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's kind of funny how this came about, because if somebody had asked me in February if I was going to be in South Africa this summer, I would have like laughed in their face. But what happened is that I was really like starting to feel anxious about next steps in my life. And so I shared that with Pastor just like right there one day. And he was like, do you know what I think you need to do? And I was expecting him to tell me like, you need to journal this and like come meet with me. And what he said was, I think you need to go to South Africa this summer. And I was, I wish I could have like recorded the thought that went through my head in that moment, because I was like, what are you talking about? And he was like, the application's due in 2 days, but I'll send it to you and like check it out if you're interested. And so I like looked at the video of the program and I said, yeah, I think this is what I'm supposed to do. I've never cranked out an application that fast in my life. And then 3 months later, I was like on a plane there. And for me, that also very much feels like spirit-led and like God's hand at work in that, because I would have never thought I was gonna be headed to South Africa. And yeah, Pastor just mentioned it on the way out of Sunday service one day. Other questions or thoughts or reflections?
So do you plan to go back?
I do, yeah. I was so ready to come home, and I was so sad to leave, and I've never felt that so acutely. I think for me, like part of the challenge when you go and you do like really transformational experiences like this, like I felt like I was leaving part of my heart in South Africa, and yeah, I can't imagine not going back. And like technology is wonderful because I've been able to stay in touch with so many of the people down there, whether it's just like sending a quick WhatsApp or whether it's like every once in a while getting to have a long like WhatsApp phone call. But yeah, like I very much feel like parts of my heart are in Southern Africa, and yeah, I can't imagine not going back. and the way the program is structured is now, so I was part of the second delegation, so now there are 3 of us who have gone on the VYLTP program who are now in South Africa, or now in the United States. And so there's conversation about, the program's committed to being around for at least 10 years. And so there's conversation about, like, what does it look like when, there are 8 delegates who now live in the US? Like, what does it look like to, build systems where, we get to spend time with each other, talking about it. In South Africa, I keep seeing pictures, they're all doing that. The connection between the 2 years is already really real in South Africa. So I am hopeful too, that once that develops and once there are more Americans who have gone on the program, that we'll have our own delegation here that gets to meet and to talk about what we're doing and to be accountable to each other and to support each other as we kind of take the seeds that were planted in the program onward in the work that we're doing.
I wanted to ask if you would say a little bit about the Palestinian connection, where Father Edwin's doing work connecting to Palestine, and even some of the kind of pieces that touch here as well. I'm reminded that last year on World Communion Sunday, we were having a presentation and launching our study as a part of our kind of fall study on the church's responsibility to Palestine. Father Edwin is very involved with the Palestinian movement in South Africa as well, and there are kind of kairos connections back and forth. I want to see if you experience some of that in conversation and community, and talk about how those connections may be made as well.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Our last Peace and Justice Week, so our second to last week there, was a whole week really on Palestine, and doing intensive historical learning and conversations about the current situation, and then brainstorming how we can individually and collectively respond to what's happening in Palestine right now. And so for me, I always thought I knew more than your average person about what was going on in Palestine, which is true. I was part of the Students for Justice in Palestine at SLU when I was there, and I just had no idea until I was in this really intensive learning space. So Father Edwin came and spoke. Father Edwin's actually banned from visiting Palestine anymore, and the woman who came in and shared with us was held when she went to visit the last time for 8 hours. And so she's I'm not allowed to go back, for my own safety, I'm not allowed to go back because her face is recognizable. And so for me, I think it's twofold with the faith and the social political, because one thing that was really important, the United States backs Israel, period, full stop, unapologetically. And so over, I think it was 47 UN resolutions have passed in support of the Palestinian people, because Israel is just having so many human rights violations. And the US, which is one of 4 countries that has veto power, has vetoed every single UN resolution. And so for me, there was so much anger at the US in that room, coming from everybody in the room, but also from myself, and disappointment in myself that I didn't know more. And so from a theological space, when I watched U.S. preacher after U.S. preacher in a documentary we watched, talk about supporting God's people, God's chosen, and so the woman, I'm forgetting her name right now, who led that discussion was we need to deconstruct this for a second. There is a difference between the ancient Israelites and the modern day Israelis. And just hearing it put Israelites and Israelis, I was they're even called something different. But we've conflated those two in the U.S., especially in white Christian denominations. And so that was really important from a faith background of we're actually talking about two different, the nation state of Israel hasn't been around except in 1948. And so that theologically that was really important. I think politically, in Missouri right now, Claire McCaskill is signed on to a bill that would punish people who are participating in BDS of Israel. So
BDS is?
Yeah, I was just getting my thumb out to say it. Boycotting, divestment, and sanctions. So like economic, like punishment. So pulling out our support for anything that would like benefit the nation state of Israel. And again, I think it goes back to what Desmond Tutu was saying, because so much of when you say like being against sort of what is like Israel is doing to the Palestinians right now, people immediately will be like, you can't be anti-Israel, like you're anti-Semitic. But again, like nuancing it of like, I'm not anti-anybody, I'm anti-injustice. And what Israel right now is doing to the Palestinian people is an injustice. And so really having to like nuance that argument. But yeah, I mean, it was overwhelming for me how much information I didn't know and how much information I was receiving, and then trying to figure out avenues. And like, yeah, like in the United States right now, like there is a lot of policies that are in motion right now to make it even more difficult to support Palestinian people and voices. So yeah, that was like a steep learning curve for me, and a heavy week from both like a social and political involvement, and also like theological, on like what I can do when I get back. And a lot of what I have been doing is having those like 101 conversations, educating folks about like the difference between ancient Israelites and the modern day nation state of Israel, and yeah, pointing people to resources. There's a really great documentary called Occupation 101, and in South Africa, there's a lot more resistance in South Africa than there is here in the U.S. because, I mean, they're calling what is happening in Palestine right now apartheid, and so the similarities between apartheid South Africa and the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land right now, I mean, it is very similar. So in a similar way that there was a Kairos document that came out of apartheid South Africa, there's a Kairos document that has come out of Palestine, really like begging Christian churches to say like this is a Christian issue. Yeah.
Good morning. I want to ask you about, I saw you eating the chicken food, but how was the other food, how has that changed your life since you've been there?
How has it changed my life?
Yeah.
A lot of ways. I think, yeah, this is like something that I think people say a lot, but once I experienced and saw what I experienced and saw in South Africa, like I can't ever look away from that again. Like my world has been broken open, and I cannot piece it back together in any kind of like neat way. And so now like instead of like just being able to think about what's going on in St. Louis, like my heart and my mind are also thinking about the injustices that are happening in Zimbabwe and that are happening in South Africa, and are like, yeah, like I think it has like forever changed my life, because I can't go back. Like I can no longer just think about myself in my own context, but am also like, yeah, it kind of goes back to what I said to your question, Thomas. Like once you know somebody, like you want to fight for them to live like a whole life, and like for me that's what it's done. Like I am on the local front trying to do that in St. Louis, but now I'm also like aware that there's a global front in South Africa, where I'm also like working on behalf of people who I've come to know and have come to love now, who are on the other side of the world.
So to put someone on the spot, although I know we've come right to our time, so that at least she has just very little time to be on the spot. Also this year, Sister LaBrille spent some time in South Africa, and wanted to see if there was maybe one thing that really impacted you while you were there, and so you want to share that with the group?
The biggest thing that, one of the biggest things that impacted me is I can't stop walking on the left side now. Like that's just where I travel. But it drives my classmates insane. But I think the biggest thing for me was working at the school, where almost half the students were orphaned. And I realized there that, like, with those children, it was quite a privilege that I was even able to travel there. Like, when you're there, when you're thinking about it before you go on the trip, it's like, okay, I'm going into the slums of South Africa, and it won't be great. But when you get to see all the different personalities and all the beautiful faces of these kids that you're working with, it really is a privilege. It's not just it's an experience for sure, but it's not just something that you can take lightly. It's not just, oh yeah, I worked with kids in Africa. It's like something that could take hours and hours and hours to explain. So I think that's the biggest thing that stuck with me. Of course, there were beautiful sights, but I honestly think working with the kids was probably one of the biggest privileges I've ever been able to experience. So, yeah. Okay, so it was a school trip, and really, it wasn't a service trip. It was just kind of to be immersed into a different cultural setting. But I think the service part of it was probably the most rewarding part of it. It was interesting to see different things that I don't see on the daily, to eat different foods, to live in a different environment. But the most rewarding part was the fact that it was working with the children. So it wasn't a service trip, but the way I remember it was as a service trip to work with these kids who didn't have anything. So,
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else to share. Well, that's a lie. I do have one thing to share. I always have something else. No, I just want to express my gratitude for the community of St. John's. I know a lot of you all in the room supported me financially. A lot of you all supported me in prayer and in community, and it meant so much for me to be over there, to know that I had this space to come back to, and that I knew I could count on you all to remind me who I was when I forgot, and to be there to catch me when I was crying, and yeah, that I would tell people about St. John's when I was there. And so there were multiple days when all 16 of us were huddled around one computer that had internet service, trying to get the live stream from St. John's to come through. Because you mean so much to me in so many ways. And I feel so blessed that I was able to come back from this trip and to come back to a space where I knew I would be pushed and challenged and inspired in the same way that I was in South Africa. So thank you all for being here.
So we're grateful to Sarah for sharing, grateful to LaBrille for sharing. Just want to close with this one reflection. One of the things that Dr. King would say about segregation always, he would kind of rooting it in theology, point back to Paul Tillich, who says sin is separation and separation is sin. Separation is sin, right? So segregation is inherently sinful because it is the separation of people. And as much as we're thoughtful about that, we also have to remember to keep the natural separations at bay. And so when we think of a theology that is good for our tribe but not good for others, then it's one thing to be rooted in our contextual experience, rooted in our history, rooted in our culture. It's another thing to be tribalistic. And so one of the challenges I was discussing with a table of clergy yesterday, including a couple of folks who have a lot of global responsibility, was the disconnectedness from the us versus them, or the this versus that mentality of mission. That we think mission is either helping people overseas or helping people at home, and we divide the two. But the reality is this is that and that is this. The other piece is every time we talk about something international or from another culture, it ain't a mission conversation. Sometimes it is, particularly when we think about World Communion Sunday, the fact that we're gathered together, we're grafted together as God's people around the table. It's not a mission thing. It's a being church thing. It's a worship thing. It's a fellowship thing. It's a community thing. It's a sisterhood thing, right? There is much for us to learn from South Africa, right? And if you pay attention to global statistics on Christianity, the mission field is here, not somewhere else. Christianity is growing in other places. It's declining here. So I don't know what we're going to feel like when all of a sudden somebody show up speaking Mandarin trying to convert us. Because if you follow the numbers, that's how it should be going right now. And so I just want to keep us mindful. These things, I said, we're still discerning what they're about, but there's a reason why LaBrille, Sarah, myself have all been over there. There's a reason why in Cozy, Dr. Busak has been here. There's much more learning for us to do. And so we're going to keep up the exchange in as much as we can. We're going to continue to share and integrate into our teaching and learning in this space so that we might see and hear what God is saying to us about this connection. And I at least believe that it is about this learning. If we're going to be engaged in the struggle here, it's one thing to look, and next year we'll do a lot of celebrations of 50 years ago. 50 years ago, King's assassination. 50 years ago, the sanitation worker strike. 50 years ago, the Resurrection City and the Poor People's Campaign. We're going to talk a lot about that, but it makes sense to look 20 years ago, too. And just because it's in South Africa rather than being in the southern parts of the United States doesn't mean it doesn't have lessons for us. So this I'm quite clear about. The last connection I'll make, August 9, 2014, in Cape Town, Father Edwin is standing on the back of a truck with Desmond Tutu on Women's Day in South Africa, which is August 9th, remembering what Reverend Reese was preaching about just a couple of weeks ago, remembering the women's uprising in Soweto in 1976, week after I was born. And so remembering those things, as Michael Brown has shot, 20,000 people are gathered in Cape Town in solidarity with Palestine, right? So these connections matter for us, and we might want to discern them as we serve a global God with global responsibility, that we ought to discern these connections. Amen? Amen. Thanks again to Deacon Nash. We invite you to gather now at this time at the altar so that we might join together in prayer. We encourage you as you go back to your seats after prayer. You're already there. May as well sit where you are. You ain't got to spread out and look for places near. Come right back to where you are so that we might begin together in worship. So I invite you to come together now at this time for prayer.